Hey everyone, today I'm going to be doing some analysis on a video by Husavi Productions. For those of you who don't know, Husavi Productions is a channel here on YouTube that makes short videos looking at all endings of a country. Similar to video games that have multiple endings, these videos look at the history of countries in this way and show some other ways the country could have ended up. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the first country that Husavi did a video on, Poland. I have Polish ancestry and I know a bit about Polish history, so I figured I would look at the 14 alternate endings that Husavi has, see how based in history it is, and give some background on the ending, as well as determining how realistic it is. Real quick before we start, what do you guys think about these all endings history videos? I saw Mercier Z make a more in-depth one and they seem like really fun videos to make, so I might actually make some in the future. I'm curious if you guys think I should make some as well. Also remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content. Before we look at the alternate endings of Poland, let's look at how Poland is today. Once a mighty nation in the Middle Ages and early modern period, Poland slowly declined until it was wiped off the map in the 18th century. For 123 years, Poland as a nation did not exist, until the turmoil of World War I set it free, reforming in 1918 out of the Versailles Treaty. Poland was ravaged soon after in World War II, and came out of that conflict decimated and behind the Iron Curtain. Poland was a communist country until 1989, and since then has become a member of the European Union and NATO, cementing itself in Europe's Fellowship of Nations. Poland is currently a democracy with borders on the Baltic Sea to the north, the Oder River in the west, the Carpathian Mountains in the south, and borders with Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania in the east. Now let's look at Husavi's alternate endings. Also keep in mind that some of these endings are totally meant to be silly and ahistorical, so if I criticize an ending, I mean no ill whatsoever towards Husavi. I'm just trying to add more historical context to the video and see how realistic it is, if it is even realistic at all, and not all of these are supposed to be realistic, so just keep that in mind. So first we have the quote-unquote good ending. Quote, after the Second World War, Poland kept Lviv and the remaining eastern lands dominated by the Poles. We see here that the map is different from real life in that Poland has an added corridor moving northeast across the Belarusian border, including the Lithuanian city of Vilnius, as well as some land towards the southeast in modern-day Ukraine, including the city of Lviv. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize, Ukrainian people. This, of course, would be a better ending than the canon one, as Poland would have more territory. After World War II, the borders of Poland were redrawn, and much of the eastern lands were taken from Poland to become part of Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. As a result, about 2.1 million Poles were forced to move west. I think it's also worth mentioning the interesting story that landed Poland Vilnius in the interwar period. The Allies had decided that Vilnius, a historical city for Lithuania, could vote on whether it became part of Poland or Lithuania. To skew the vote, however, Poland sent in the military into the city and settled lots of Polish people there, and by the time the election rolled around, the city voted to be part of Poland, angering Lithuania, who probably had a real, actually better claim to the city. This ending, of course, would probably weaken Poland's eastern neighbors and lead to longer-term contention between Poland and Lithuania especially. In real life, however, Poland didn't get this land since Stalin wanted land for Ukraine and Belarus, and the Allies wanted to right the wrong after the First World War with Lithuania. In exchange, Poland received land to the west, which used to be part of Germany. Fun fact, or not so fun fact, actually, after World War II, the Poles were, shall we say, not very happy with what the Germans did to them, and Poland actually carried out a bit of a genocide against Germany and killed about 2 million Germans in the western parts of what would become Poland. Overall, I think this is decently realistic, as the areas added on the map were also more Polish before the war. Looking at the ultimate good ending, we see that Piłsudski, by persuading France to a war against Germany in 1933, saved Poland from the horrors of World War II. we see that Poland maintained its interwar borders in this timeline. Let's start with Piłsudski. Józef Piłsudski was one of the founders of modern Poland. He fought with the Austrians in World War I, hoping to use the conflict as an opportunity to recreate Poland, which had been non-existent as a country since 1795. In 1918, he was one of the chief state builders and became head of state until 1922. In 1920, he famously repelled the Soviet invasion in Warsaw and fought 5 other wars to define Poland's borders. In 1926, he came to power again in a coup d'etat and remained in power until he died in 1935. Piłsudski was concerned about the rise of everyone's favorite German, and he was a militarist, making it in his character to want to invade Germany in 1933. France ultimately would not do this in our timeline, although it was completely possible for them to do so. France and Poland would likely win quite quickly, and the only thing that I find unrealistic about this is the map. If Poland went to war and won against Germany, there is a decent chance that they would gain territory in East Prussia and along the Oder River, although this may not have happened since the Allies wouldn't have wanted to further attack Germany. Although, if they are invading, they probably wouldn't care at that point. Next, we have the bad ending. Despite the liberation from the Germans, Poland lost its independence, becoming part of the Soviet Union. We see that the only noticeable difference is the loss of the Podlaskia voidship in the northeast. For some brief context, Poland was liberated near the end of World War II by the Soviet Union. In the years following the war, Poland was supposed to have free elections, but ended up becoming a communist dictatorship in alliance with the USSR. Given that Poland was sold out by the Allies in the Yalta Conference, where Churchill and FDR allowed Stalin to effectively control the eastern half of Europe, I think it is quite feasible that Poland could have become a part of the USSR. The only thing that really stopped this in real life was that Stalin didn't want to push his luck with the West too much, given that tensions were rising dramatically around that time. I'm still confused about why the map would change, but that's my only real nitpick. Even worse is the ultimate bad ending. As a result of Germany's victory in World War II, the Polish nation and culture were almost completely destroyed. This is definitely the worst ending in Husavi's video, and it's pretty clear why. On the map, we see that Poland is reduced to Lesser Poland, which in our timeline became the general government, and Ruthenia. This sort of makes sense since most of the useful land would be annexed by the Germans. However, eventually Poland just wouldn't exist at all, as the Mustache Man wanted a total elimination of Slavic peoples, believing that they were barely human. Of course, if this had happened, millions upon millions of people would have died, on top of the 5 million that died in our timeline. We could probably see massive emigration further east and into America and non-occupied areas as well. Honestly, the only reason this map is inaccurate is that A, the Poles are far too resilient to be almost completely destroyed, and B, eventually there would be no Poland to even map. Still in the vein of bad endings, we have the communist ending. Despite the collapse of the Soviet bloc, Poland remained communist under General Jaruzelski and his junta. This one is a bit more outrageous, since Poland is pretty much the least communist of the communist countries in the Eastern Bloc, so there's no way that they would continue to be communist after the collapse of the USSR. For some context, as we said earlier, Poland became a communist state after World War II, before becoming a democracy in 1939. The fall of communism was overseen by Wojciech Jaruzelski, these Polish names, man, who served as Poland's main dictator from 1981 to 89. As Jaruzelski was coming into power, Poland was undergoing some instability after the Solidarity labor movement organized strikes against the government. In response, the dictator declared martial law, which lasted until 1984. For a while, historians believed that the reason Jaruzelski did this was to preempt a Soviet invasion by demonstrating that things were under control in Poland. However, it is now understood that he actually asked the Soviets for help, but they refused to do so, deciding that if Poland rebuked communism, that they could do so without interference. Despite this, Jaruzelski wasn't very radical, as seen in 1989 when the Solidarity movement was granted political legitimacy and won a sweeping victory in the Polish Sejm, or parliament. Rather than squash this wave of democracy, Jaruzelski allowed for this to stand and ultimately was peacefully voted out of office, so I find it highly unlikely that he would try to keep Poland communist. Poland was also a very anti-communist country by this time, and compared to the rest of the Eastern Bloc, so even if he tried this, he wouldn't last very long. Next is the divided ending. After World War II, Poland was divided along the Vistula in a pro-Western and pro-Soviet part. This is another one that doesn't really make sense to me. As we see on the map, Poland is divided in half along the Vistula River, which divides Poland roughly into eastern and western halves. We see that the western half doesn't reach the modern Polish borders, nor does it match the interwar western border. To the east, we see that Poland once again retains possession of Vilnius and Lviv. This idea, of course, is inspired by what happened to Germany after World War II, when it was divided into eastern and western parts, one communist and one democratic. I think this map makes sense for what a divided Poland would look like, as it would gain more eastern land since it had lost its western half, but I don't think that Poland would ever be divided like this. The only way that this happens is that the Western Allies take over Germany, and for some reason kept pushing east, which doesn't really make sense since they were concerned with beating Germany, not necessarily retaking Poland. There also wasn't any major cultural split between East and West in Poland, so this wouldn't be a split that the Poles would make themselves. It's also unlikely that even if there was, that the West would actually support their side in any significant way. That being said, if the rest of history changed so that Poland became the split point between East and West, I think these are good borders. Finally, moving into some good endings, we have the intermerium endings. Thanks to the success of the intermerium concept, a powerful counter to the German and Soviet ambitions was created. Here we see that Poland is not just interwar Poland, but also the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, Yugoslavia, Austria-Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. For the story behind this one, we have to go back to Józef Piłsudski and the Treaty of Versailles. Aside from just wanting a strong Poland, Piłsudski and the Allies also wanted a way to check Germany as well as the rising Soviet Union. Poland, as we saw in World War II, was not capable of doing this by itself, and neither were any of the other nations in between the superpowers. However, many thought that if these countries banded together to form a supernation or confederacy, they would be much more effective at checking both enemies. This became known as the intermerium concept, which is Latin for between seas, as this new country would span from the Baltic to the Adriatic to the Black Seas. This, however, failed for nationalistic reasons. Piłsudski wanted Poland to be in charge of Intermeria, and other nations, namely the Baltic states and Ukraine, had a contentious relationship with Poland and wanted to be separate. World War I and its aftermath saw the dismantling of empires, but this would be the creation of one. The USSR was also, unsurprisingly, opposed, although France was not. This is actually going to be a trend we're going to see. A lot of the interwar stuff with Poland, France is very supportive of. In hindsight, this may actually have been a good idea, as every country involved eventually was taken over by Germany, the Soviet Union, or both, during or right after World War II. The only inaccuracy I see in this ending is that Finland was also a country that was proposed to be part of Intermeria. As for how successful the country would have been, we can only guess, although it would be very in line with Polish history, as Poland had historically been a very pluralistic and diverse nation. Intermeria would be even more so, with Slavs, Uralics, Romantics, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims all being under one banner. That being said, nationalism and ethno-nationalism were becoming more popular at this time, so maybe it would have ended up like Yugoslavia and collapsed into civil war and chaos. The Yagellonian ending is the first ending here that isn't modern. This is going to be a tough one. Władysław Warmińczyk, avoiding death at Varna, managed to unite all countries ruled by the Yagellonians. On the map, we see that Poland controls a wide swath of Central and Eastern Europe, covering what were the historical borders of Lithuania, Hungary, and Croatia. To understand this one and all the unpronounceable words involved, we need to dive much deeper into Polish history. This alternate ending is based in the 1400s with the rise of the Yagellonian dynasty. Essentially, this dynasty was created when Poland and Lithuania united with the marriage of Queen Jadwiga of Poland to King Jagiełło of Lithuania and the conversion of the Lithuanian nation and king to Christianity. This is actually different from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which formed over a century later after the countries had separated for a time, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, Jagiełło's son Władysław became king of Poland and Lithuania in 1434 at the age of 10. By 1440, he inherited the crowns of Hungary and Croatia as well, and for 4 years he ruled all 4 kingdoms at once. This came to an end in 1444, however, when King Władysław went to war with the Ottoman Empire and died at the Battle of Varna at the young age of 20. After his death, Hungary, Croatia, and Lithuania went their separate ways, and Poland was left without a king for 3 years following issues of succession. Had Władysław never died, it is possible that he would have consolidated power in Central Eastern Europe and created a super-state to rival his Western neighbors. He was young, so he would have had lots of time to do this, but I don't know how long this would go on, and my guess is that after his death, or maybe a couple kings after his death, the kingdoms would simply split apart, and I don't think it's likely that other kingdoms would necessarily join. My main reason for thinking this is that a couple Polish monarchs who succeeded Casimir the Great a century earlier also came to rule Hungary and Bohemia as well as Poland, but they still split apart anyway. The time this would last until is also unspecified, so maybe this ending is around 1500 instead of 2021, but I'm not sure what Jusawi's thoughts were here. That being said, we may never know what King Władysław would have done with his life. Moving back to another ending that's more bad than good, we have the tsarist ending. With the victory of Russia in World War I, Poland regained independence as a Russian protectorate. On the map, we see that Pomerania, Greater Poland, and Masovia are included. Interestingly, this is sort of a mirrored version of the Kingdom of Poland under Russian rule, which has a branch moving to the northeast. For the history behind this ending, we need to understand what happened to Poland after the partitions. In 1772, 1793, and 1795, Poland was incrementally partitioned by its neighbors of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. After 1795, Poland as a country ceased to exist. However, of the 3 partitioning powers, Russia was the most charitable to Poland, and the country enjoyed some autonomy through the early 19th century, acting as a cultural hub and even pioneering the educational systems that would later be used across the Russian Empire. However, the Poles, being an independent-minded and rebellious people, frequently revolted against Russia. This happened in a major way in the November Uprising from 1830 to 31, where the Polish Sejm deposed Nicholas II of Russia as their king. This led to a reduction in autonomy, and this process was complete after the January Revolution in 1863-64, when Poland lost any separateness from the Russian Empire. And just in case you were wondering, Poland did end up losing both of those revolutions. In this timeline, however, this autonomy, or at least some of it, would come back if Russia won World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution never happened. Poland, or at least the Russian parts of it, would have fought for Russia against the Central Powers, which was actually an issue that the Poles were split on. Pilsudski, who we talked about earlier, wanted to use the Central Powers of Germany and Austria to defeat Russia, then have the Allies defeat the Central Powers. In the end, he got his wish, as we know, since that's how World War I ended up going. Others, however, like his right-wing rival Roman Dmowski, wanted to fight with Russia and use Russia to unite the other Polish lands in Germany and Austria. In this timeline, Dmowski got his wish, and we see some unification of German land back into Poland, although Austrian holdings would be the same as if Pilsudski got his way. I think this is another very interesting one with lots of history behind it, and I think that is definitely a realistic alternative. Another older ending is the good Rzeczpospolita ending. Poland-Lithuania, by carrying out reforms, managed to survive with its borders intact until World War I. The map shows the borders of Poland in 1772, before the first partition. We talked about the partitions of Poland already, and the Rzeczpospolita was the institution that existed right before the partition. This word means republic or commonwealth, and for this to exist until World War I, we need a few things to change. First, Poland would have to reform sooner. Poland at this point operated as a republic, where kings were elected by the noble class, or szlachta, which made up about 10% of the population. However, it had a massive issue in its system, especially with the liberum veto, which called for unanimous decision-making in the Sejm, allowing one noble to disrupt the entire country. This ended up being exploited by Catherine the Great of Russia, who used the Sejm to enact policies to weaken Poland and even elect her own lover, Stanisław Poniatowski, to the throne. After the first partition of Poland in 1772, the Poles did end up reforming, getting rid of the liberum veto, changing to a hereditary model for the king, and ratifying the world's second constitution in 1791, with only America making a constitution first. These reforms mostly came too late and coincided with the French Revolution, causing the European powers to be very nervous about liberal reforms, which made it easier to justify an invasion of Poland. But if they came earlier, then it's possible that Poland would exist through to World War I, although it would likely have some different borders slightly. After World War I, depending on which side it was on, I might have to make a video about that actually, Poland may be carved up like the other continental empires. Moving to a more outrageous theme, we have the Rogozinski, and how do you say that? We have the Rogozinski ending. Stefan Szrok Rogozinski managed to create a Polish state in Cameroon in 1882, named Rogosia in his honor. We see on the map that the borders are not the same as modern-day Cameroon, but encompass the central southern areas of that country. For some background, Russia, like all the other European powers, was looking into colonizing Africa in the 1880s and sent expeditions to the continent. At the head of an 1882 expedition to modern-day Cameroon, Stefan Szrok Rogozinski, while Russia and what remained of the Polish government simply wanted him to explore the area, other influential Poles wanted him to see if he could found a Polish colony for the Poles to migrate to. Rogozinski also worked for England in this area, but due to a lack of funding, although France, once again supporting the Poles, did give him some money, and England's commitment to honor German claims in Africa in 1885, Rogosia never came to pass. For this to happen, Russia would have had to be more active in the scramble for Africa. I also can't find anything that shows the same borders that Usavi uses, although if someone can, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Also, for those wondering, Poland never had any real colonies, although for a brief period the King of Poland was King Henry de Valois of France, and Poland agreed to send Poles to help settle early French colonies in Trinidad and Tobago and Namibia. The rest of these entries are more far-fetched, and the Zaporoslovian ending is no exception. After World War I, the nations of Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, and Ruthenia were united within the Federation of Zaporoslovia. On the map we see that Czechoslovakia, Ruthenia, and interwar Poland with modern eastern borders make up this country. Zaporoslovia is an idea from the fictional alternate history universe of Francoverse, as well as an inspired mod in Hearts of Iron. In this Francoverse lore, Zaporoslovia, meaning Western Slavic, was a Czech move to create a confederacy in Central Europe after World War I against Germany and Russia. This is essentially a less realistic, less ambitious version of the intermerium concept, but instead of being created at the Treaty of Versailles, it would happen throughout the interwar period. I don't think that Czechoslovakia would be the ones to unify the Slavic lands, since they just didn't have as much power or size as Poland, so I don't think this one is as realistic as the intermerium concept, although I definitely want to look more into Francoverse, which I hadn't heard of before this video. Next is the cursed Skodovska ending. Poland became a superpower with the help of the deadly laser invented by Maria Skodowska-Curie. The borders here include Prussia, Austria-Hungary, Ruthenia, Belarus, Lithuania, and Western Russia, including a branch into what seems like Moscow. Mary Skodowska, better known as Mary Curie in the West, was an early scientific pioneer in radioactivity. She was Polish, but did lots of her work in France and was a naturalized French citizen, and many people don't know her maiden name. She was also the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. During her research, Curie discovered various new elements, including radium and polonium, which she named after her native country of Poland. Curie did most of her work in the late 1800s and early 1900s when Poland was still not a country, although she lived all the way up until 1934, making it possible that she could have developed a superweapon for the Poles if she was so inclined. She certainly was patriotic of Poland, but she seems to have been more oriented towards peace, using her work with radioactivity to help treat cancer and provide x-rays for people rather than make weapons. But if she did create a super weapon for Poland, they may have been successful if they had timed their attacks right, especially if they were towards the end of World War I. The Poles could surprise the Germans and Austrians on the Eastern Front, as Russia may have pulled out by that point, while also attacking Russia while it was going through its own revolution. The Allies may have allowed Poland to exist, since it not only could quell the Central Powers, but also the threat of communism, changing the whole world after World War I. As for the type of weapon that would be made, it probably wouldn't be a laser, since that wasn't what Skodovska worked on, but it could have been some sort of radioactive weapon that gave its targets acute cancer. It wouldn't have been a nuke, since Mary was focused on radioactivity rather than fission, so it wouldn't have anything to do with explosions, but her weapon would actually probably be a bit worse, and eventually be banned along with other chemical weapons. Ultimately, I don't think that this one is that realistic, although it is interesting to think what would happen if Poland rallied and created a state for itself before the Treaty of Versailles without the help of the Allies. And finally, for the most absurd of all, we have the Orange King ending. Quote, the great Polish philanthropist Testoviron returned from Chicago buying Poland for $1. I actually had to do some research on this one, but Testoviron, I don't know how to pronounce that, is a Polish music artist that made pop and EDM style music. In 2011, he came out with an EP album titled Orange King, hence the name of this ending, and apparently he currently lives in Illinois, but not in Chicago. This one is obviously absurd, since Testoviron is an obscure artist that you can't even find on Spotify, and he has like 10 songs, but this idea of a musical philanthropist saving Poland is actually not far-fetched, and has happened before in Polish history. In the ending years of World War I, the Allies were beginning to discuss their plans for Europe. One of the big ideas, especially from American President Woodrow Wilson, was the idea of self-determination for countries. That being said, not every country could be given self-determination, as sometimes it would conflict with other countries. Poland was one such question mark, but as it turned out, Poland actually was explicitly mentioned as one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Why did Poland get this attention while other countries didn't? The answer, in part, is Ignacy Jan Paderewski. Paderewski was a Polish composer and philanthropist that lived in America during World War I. During the war, he toured America and advocated for the recreation of the Polish state, an idea that was especially popular among the many Polish immigrants in America. His cause was so popular that he ended up meeting with President Woodrow Wilson and even played piano for him, bringing him to tears, eventually getting him personally invested in Poland's cause. After the war, Paderewski became Prime Minister of Poland in 1919, and before that played a large role in placating the hostile Polish leadership factions who had very different visions for Poland's future. Eventually, however, Paderewski would resign from his prime ministership and ended up leaving Poland to escape the chaotic political climate. When World War II started, however, he once again toured Europe and the United States to advocate for Poland and against the Mustache Man, and restarted a Poland Relief Fund before dying in 1941 of natural causes. So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Big shout out to Husavi Productions. Go and check out the channel with the first link in the description, as well as the video itself that this is based on. Let me know if you guys like content like this, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Have a great day, everyone, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.